The rain pelted down in sheets as Eleanor pulled her car into the small town of Black Hollow. She'd been traveling for hours through the twisting backroads, heading to a forgotten part of the state to escape the memories that haunted her. Her only company was the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the dim yellow glow of her headlights on the deserted road. She glanced down at her phone's dead battery. Typical, she thought, just when I need it most. But the warmth of a distant gas station sign beckoned in the gloom. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of diesel and faintly spoiled coffee. A grizzled old man stood behind the counter, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. His one good eye seemed to flicker with recognition, as if he'd been expecting her. "Rough night for a drive, miss," he rasped, not looking away. "Tell me about it," Eleanor replied, brushing rainwater from her hair. "Do you have a charger I could use? My phone died about 20 miles back." The man stared at her for a beat too long before shaking his head. "No charger. Phones don't last long around these parts anyway." She forced a smile, more to brush off the unease creeping up her spine than to be polite. "That's all right. Do you have a restroom?" He nodded slowly and pointed down a dim hallway at the back of the store. "Use the one by the storeroom, but make it quick," he said. "You don't want to linger." Eleanor moved down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The walls seemed to close in on her as she approached the restroom door, barely held together by rusted hinges. The fluorescent light flickered, throwing shadows that danced across the walls. She quickly shut the door behind her, locking it with a rickety latch. As she washed her hands, she heard faint, erratic footsteps outside. A cold sense of dread crept over her. She pressed her ear to the door, listening. The footsteps stopped, replaced by an eerie scraping sound, like nails on metal. Eleanor's heart hammered as she cracked the door open, peering down the hall. The lights continued their erratic flickering, revealing nothing. She edged out of the restroom and turned back toward the front counter. The old man was gone. A shiver ran down her spine, but she brushed it off as an overactive imagination. It was just a rundown gas station, after all. Maybe he'd gone to the back to stock shelves. But as she turned to leave, a flicker of movement caught her eye in the reflection of the glass door. She froze, staring at the pale, smudged face that appeared just behind her shoulder. "Need a ride?" The voice whispered, its tone chillingly familiar, like an echo of her own thoughts. She spun around, but there was no one there. The store was empty, silent. Her heart raced as she bolted outside, barely noticing the rain soaking her as she rushed back to her car. Once inside, she locked the doors and gripped the wheel, willing herself to calm down. She needed to find somewhere else, anywhere else, to stay for the night. Just as she was about to pull out of the lot, her headlights illuminated something standing by the edge of the woods. A figure cloaked in shadows, tall and thin, its head cocked unnaturally to one side, watching her with an intensity that pierced through the darkness. She could barely make out its features, but its eyes glowed with a dull, hungry light. Eleanor's breath caught as she felt it somehow reaching into her mind. A crawling, invasive presence that seemed to pull at her memories. Her mind flashed to images of her childhood, her family, friends, but then sharply to her mother, lying still and cold, her mouth frozen in a scream. A scream that echoed in Eleanor's mind even now. Her hands shook as she fumbled to start the car, but the engine sputtered, refusing to turn over. Desperation clawed at her. She tried again, praying under her breath, as that figure crept closer, moving with an unnerving, bone-cracking gait. The engine finally roared to life, and Eleanor floored it, peeling out of the gas station and down the deserted road. But the dark figure didn't vanish in her rearview mirror. Instead, it seemed to dissolve into the shadows, disappearing as the rain-soaked trees swallowed it whole. For hours, Eleanor drove, her mind racing, trying to comprehend what she'd seen. She knew she couldn't keep driving indefinitely, but the thought of stopping brought back that crawling feeling of dread. Just as the first rays of dawn stretched across the sky, she spotted a roadside motel, small and worn but offering a temporary escape. Inside, the motel was eerily silent. She checked in with a weary clerk who didn't even look up as he handed her a key. The room was small, stale-smelling, with peeling wallpaper and a single flickering lamp, but she was too exhausted to care. Collapsing onto the bed, Eleanor closed her eyes, hoping for a few hours of dreamless sleep. But as soon as she drifted off, her dreams twisted into nightmare. In the dream, she was standing in a dark, endless hallway, surrounded by shadowed faces that whispered her name, voices slipping into her mind like tendrils of smoke. A cold hand touched her shoulder, pulling her deeper into the darkness. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as those familiar, echoing words crawled up her spine. "Need a ride?" The voice rasped, sending an icy stab of terror through her. With a gasp, Eleanor jolted awake, her body drenched in cold sweat. She stumbled to the bathroom, splashing water on her face, forcing herself to breathe. But as she looked up, her reflection in the mirror was wrong. Her face was distorted, stretched, with eyes that glowed faintly, hollow and empty. She blinked, and it was gone. Just her own frightened face staring back. But then, in the silence, she heard the faintest scraping sound, like nails on metal, coming from just outside her door. She inched closer, listening as the sound grew louder, followed by the steady, erratic footsteps she recognized from the gas station. With trembling hands, she peered through the peephole. Standing just beyond her door was the same dark figure, its head cocked to one side, its glowing eyes locked onto hers through the tiny glass. Her heart thundered as she slowly backed away, knowing she couldn't run, couldn't hide. Then, in a voice that was neither her own nor entirely human, it whispered one final time, the words embedding themselves into her mind. "Need a ride?" The door handle twisted, and as the last light flickered out, Eleanor realized she was no longer alone. The storm was unrelenting, a churning, angry force as Kevin stumbled through the undergrowth. Lost, exhausted, and miles from the nearest town, he could barely remember how he ended up this deep in the forest. His camping trip with friends had spiraled out of control when they'd all had a little too much to drink. They were just going to explore for a bit, they'd said. See the stars, the sounds, maybe freak each other out a little. It was all in good fun. But now, Kevin was alone, and the dense darkness around him felt anything but fun. A crackling sound came from somewhere close by, snapping him from his thoughts. Kevin froze, listening, but all he heard was the heavy drumming of rain and the eerie whisper of the wind weaving through the trees. He took a shaky breath, deciding it was just a fallen branch, nothing to worry about. He pulled his phone from his pocket, 4% battery, a few faint bars, and no signal. He tried dialing one of his friends anyway, hoping for a miracle. The line crackled, static flooding his ear. Then, through the hiss of interference, a voice came. Kevin. His heart stilled. "Jack," he whispered, recognizing his friend's voice. "Jack, where are you?" "Kevin, I don't know," the voice crackled, faint and distorted. "Where are you?" Kevin asked, his heart pounding, his voice catching, but the line went dead. No bars, no connection. He tried calling back, only to be met with a black screen as his phone died in his hands. "Great," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The oppressive quiet settled around him again, more suffocating now than before. Kevin pushed on, branches scraping his arms and legs as he picked his way through the dark. Every sound, every whisper of the wind felt like eyes on him, shadows that waited just out of sight. He'd just about convinced himself that it was his imagination when he saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees up ahead. Hope surged through him. Maybe it was his friends setting up camp or another group out here who could help. He approached cautiously, his footsteps barely making a sound as he moved closer. But as he reached the edge of a small clearing, he stopped dead in his tracks. In the middle of the clearing was a cabin, barely standing, its walls warped and covered in creeping vines. The windows were shattered and the door hung at a twisted angle. A single lantern burned on the porch, casting an eerie glow that threw elongated shadows across the ground. Kevin's instincts screamed for him to turn back, but the storm was getting worse, and he had nowhere else to go. Reluctantly, he stepped onto the porch, his fingers brushing the cold, wet handle of the door. It creaked open with a groan, and Kevin stepped inside, heart thudding. The cabin's interior was as decayed as its exterior. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like ghostly tendrils, and the air was thick with a damp, rotting smell that clung to his lungs. His eyes adjusted to the dim light from the lantern, illuminating dusty furniture covered in dark stains that he couldn't and didn't want to identify. He moved deeper inside, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. The silence was absolute, pressing down on him as he approached a small table in the center of the room. On it lay an old, frayed photograph, a black and white picture of 4 people, 3 men and a woman standing side by side, all staring directly at the camera with expressions that made Kevin's skin crawl. Their eyes were intense, hollow, as if they could see right through him. As he turned away, something caught his eye. Hanging on the wall above the table was a large mirror, tarnished and covered in dust. Kevin walked over to it, wiping a small circle clear with his sleeve. His reflection stared back, pale and nervous, but as he started to turn away, something moved in the mirror. He whipped his head around, scanning the room, but there was no one there. Swallowing hard, he looked back at the mirror. This time, his reflection was wrong. The eyes staring back at him were empty, devoid of any light. He stumbled back, heart pounding, but the reflection remained, and then it smiled. It wasn't his smile, it was twisted too wide, with teeth too sharp. Kevin's breathing grew ragged as his reflection stepped forward, pressing its hands against the other side of the glass as if trying to push through. His mind screamed for him to move, to run, but his legs felt rooted to the floor. "Let me out," the reflection whispered, the sounds scraping along his bones like broken glass. "No, no," Kevin managed, his voice a strangled whisper. His reflection's face twisted into a sneer, pressing harder against the glass, which began to warp and ripple as if it were water instead of glass. "Let me out," it repeated, louder this time, the voice reverberating around the room. Kevin took a stumbling step back, eyes wide, as his reflection's hands began to push through, fingers emerging from the mirror, skeletal and inhuman. With a cry, Kevin turned and ran, but as he reached the door, it slammed shut, locking him inside. He pounded on it, desperation clawing at him as he glanced over his shoulder. The reflection had pulled itself halfway through the mirror, its hollow eyes boring into him. "Please," Kevin whispered, choking on fear as he backed away, hands shaking. The figure stepped free of the mirror, standing before him now, towering, looming, its face a twisted version of his own. "Don't leave," it whispered, mocking his voice, as it stretched a hand toward him. He tried to scream, but his voice was trapped in his throat, terror freezing him in place. And then the lights went out. Hours later, the storm finally broke, and a faint dawn light crept through the trees, illuminating the now empty clearing. The cabin was gone, as if it had never been there, leaving no trace but the faint outline of footprints in the mud that led nowhere. Kevin's friends found his campsite that morning, his belongings scattered around as if he'd left in a hurry. But there was no sign of Kevin. The search went on for days, weeks even, but he was never found. Years later, hikers passing through the woods would sometimes speak of a strange figure that they'd catch glimpses of out of the corner of their eye. A shadow with hollow eyes and a twisted smile that vanished before they could truly see it. And if they listened closely on quiet, misty mornings, they'd hear a faint, desperate whisper echoing through the trees, "Let me out." It was late, and the rural highway was almost empty, with only the occasional truck rumbling past. Laura's GPS had gone dead miles back, and her phone was almost out of battery. She cursed herself for not charging it before she left. The road stretched dark and empty in both directions, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to lean toward the road, as if listening. The moon hung heavy in the sky, casting long, thin shadows that wavered as she drove. As she rounded a bend, her headlights caught sight of a figure standing on the side of the road. A woman in a white dress, her back to the road, head tilted down as if she were looking at something in her hands. Laura slowed down, frowning. It was the middle of nowhere. No houses, no cars parked nearby, just this lone woman, standing like a statue. Against her better judgment, Laura rolled down her window as she came to a stop beside her. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman didn't turn around or acknowledge her in any way. Laura hesitated, glancing at her gas gauge. She didn't have much left, and she was anxious to keep going. But something compelled her to try one more time. She leaned out of the window, calling louder. "Do you need a ride? It's dangerous out here." This time, the woman turned slowly, her movements almost mechanical, and Laura felt an involuntary shiver. The woman's face was shadowed, hidden in the folds of her hair, but something felt wrong. Very wrong. Laura couldn't put her finger on it, but an instinct deep in her gut screamed for her to leave. The woman lifted a hand, pale and slender, her fingers curled as if holding something. She raised it to her mouth and made a strange, soft hissing noise. Then she laughed, a sound that started low and soft, then grew louder and more shrill, scraping against Laura's nerves. She suddenly felt cold, as if the warmth had been sucked out of the air. Without thinking, Laura hit the gas, speeding away, her heart pounding. The woman's laugh echoed in her mind as she tried to shake off the image of that hand and the way the woman's head had tilted just a bit too far, as though her neck were loose. A mile down the road, her heart was just starting to calm when she glanced in her rearview mirror and felt it stop cold. The woman was in the back seat, her face hidden by her long, dark hair, sitting perfectly still. Laura's scream caught in her throat as she slammed the brakes. She turned around, heart pounding in her chest, but the back seat was empty. Trembling, she checked again, barely daring to breathe. Nothing. It was just her imagination. It had to be. She laughed nervously, shaking her head. Get a grip, Laura. You're exhausted, that's all. But as she straightened back into her seat and put the car in drive, she froze. The woman's face was in the mirror, staring back at her. Except this time she could see her eyes wide, empty, and endlessly dark. Help me, the woman whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. Laura's hands were glued to the wheel, unable to move, her mind screaming at her to get out. But she was paralyzed, caught in the woman's empty gaze. The woman's mouth twisted into a smile, her teeth too sharp, her lips too wide. Then the woman leaned forward, her voice a rasping whisper. You can't leave me. I'm already here. With a surge of strength born of sheer terror, Laura threw open her door, stumbling out into the road. She ran, her feet pounding the pavement, her heart racing, not daring to look back. She heard the woman's laughter echoing behind her, following her through the still night air. Laura finally stopped running, collapsing on the side of the road, gasping for breath. She glanced back at her car, parked in the middle of the empty highway. There was no one inside. But as she watched, the car lights flickered, then slowly dimmed. She waited, shivering, for someone to pass by. After what felt like hours, a truck finally pulled over. The driver, a burly man with a kindly face, offered her a ride to the next town. Laura climbed in, grateful but shaken. As they drove in silence, the man glanced at her, concern evident in his eyes. You all right, miss? You look like you've seen a ghost. Laura forced a weak smile, but her hands were still trembling. Yeah, just had a strange encounter back there. The man nodded slowly, his face thoughtful. Wouldn't be the first. You're not the only one to see her, you know. Laura's blood turned to ice. What do you mean? The man kept his eyes on the road. They call her the hitchhiker. Been seen on this road for years, just standing there, looking lost. People who stop to help while most don't make it to town. Laura swallowed hard, her mouth dry as dust. What happens to them? The man's eyes met hers, his expression solemn. No one really knows, but a lot of folks who pick her up are never seen again. Sometimes we just find their cars on the side of the road, empty. They rode in silence after that, and Laura didn't look back at her car. She just hoped that whatever was haunting the lonely highway was far behind her now. But as the truck passed by a dark curve, she caught sight of something in the side mirror. A figure standing by the edge of the road. A woman in a white dress, her head tilted, her eyes empty as she watched them pass. Laura turned away, a cold shiver running down her spine as she vowed never to take that road again. But even as she stared at the road ahead, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer alone. And in the silence, faint but clear, she thought she heard a whisper. You can't leave me. I'm already here. The evening fog rolled thick and heavy as Mark drove home from his late shift, the road barely visible under the beam of his headlights. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 2:13 a.m. It was pitch dark, with no other cars in sight, and he felt the familiar drowsiness creeping in. Just 10 more miles, he told himself. Then he'd be home. As he rounded a bend, his headlights fell upon a figure standing on the shoulder of the road. It was a young girl, pale and thin, wearing a long nightgown that looked old-fashioned, like something out of another era. Her head was bowed, her long, tangled hair hiding her face. The sight jolted him fully awake, and he slowed to a stop a few feet away, the engine idling. Mark rolled down his window, unease prickling his skin. Are you all right? He called out, trying to keep his voice steady. Do you need a ride? The girl didn't respond. She just stood there, perfectly still, her head bowed. A chill swept over him, but he brushed it off as the cold night air. He was probably overthinking it. She was just a kid who'd gotten lost. He turned off his engine and stepped out of the car, pulling his jacket closer around him. "Hey," he said gently, approaching her. "Are you lost? I can take you somewhere safe." At that, the girl lifted her head, and Mark felt his stomach twist. Her face was gaunt, her skin almost translucent, with dark circles under her hollow eyes. Her gaze was empty, unfocused, as though she were looking through him rather than at him. "Please, help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible, like the rustle of leaves. Mark forced himself to stay calm, nodding as he took another step closer. "Of course, I can help you. Just tell me where you need to go." But the girl simply stared at him, her mouth hanging slightly open as if she'd forgotten how to speak. Then, without warning, she turned and began to walk down a narrow trail that led into the trees on the side of the road. She moved slowly, almost as if she were floating rather than walking. "Wait, where are you going?" Mark called out, feeling a surge of dread. He wasn't sure why, but he couldn't shake the feeling that following her would be a terrible mistake. But the girl didn't stop, didn't even look back. She disappeared into the thick fog, her white nightgown just barely visible through the haze. Mark hesitated, glancing back at his car, every rational part of him screaming to leave. But something compelled him forward, a strange pull he couldn't explain. Taking a deep breath, he followed her. The trail was narrow and dark, and every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the rustling of branches, his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He could just barely see her figure up ahead, a pale blur in the fog, moving silently through the trees. As he drew closer, the fog seemed to thicken, swirling around him until he could barely see his own hand in front of his face. The sounds of the forest faded, replaced by an unnatural silence that made his skin crawl. Suddenly, the girl stopped and turned to face him. Mark froze. Her eyes were wide, filled with an expression of terror that sent a shiver down his spine. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Who?" he asked, his own voice barely a whisper. But before he could move, a new sound broke the silence, a distant, rhythmic chanting, faint at first but growing louder. It was like a low murmur, an unintelligible chorus of voices that seemed to come from all around them, echoing through the trees. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was dark, ominous, filled with a sense of dread. The girl took a step back, her eyes fixed on something behind him. Mark turned, his heart racing as he tried to see through the thick fog. Shadows began to emerge, figures cloaked in darkness, moving slowly toward them. They were human shapes, but their movements were strange, jerky, as if they were being pulled along by invisible strings. "Run," the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They won't stop. They never stop." Panic gripped him, and he grabbed the girl's hand, pulling her with him as he stumbled back toward the road. But no matter how fast they ran, the chanting grew louder, closer, the shadows closing in around them. Mark's heart pounded as they reached the edge of the trail, his car just barely visible through the fog. He yanked the door open, pushing the girl into the passenger seat before scrambling in himself and slamming the door shut. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he tried to start the engine. Finally, the car roared to life, and he sped down the road, his eyes glued to the rearview mirror. But there was nothing behind them. No shadows, no figures, just the empty road disappearing into the fog. The girl sat silently beside him, staring straight ahead, her face pale and expressionless. Mark tried to catch his breath, his mind racing. He wanted to ask her what had happened, who those figures were, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. He drove for several miles, the silence between them thick and heavy, until he finally mustered the courage to glance at her. But the passenger seat was empty. Mark's heart stopped, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he looked around the car, but she was gone. He slammed on the brakes, his mind reeling as he tried to process what had happened. He was alone, completely alone. He sat there for a moment, his breathing ragged, before he forced himself to keep driving. It had to have been his imagination, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. That was the only explanation. But as he pulled onto his street, relief washing over him, he saw something in his rearview mirror. Standing by the side of the road, just beyond the reach of his taillights, was the girl, watching him with that same empty gaze, her mouth stretched into a slight, chilling smile. And then he heard it. The faint, rhythmic chanting creeping into the silence, growing louder, closer. Mark's blood turned to ice as he realized the truth. He hadn't left her behind. Whatever had followed him from that trail was still with him, and it wasn't going to let him go. In his final moments, as the chanting filled his car, drowning out his screams, he understood. The girl had never needed saving. She had simply needed a way out. The clock read 1:43 a.m. when Julia heard the knock at her front door. She froze, her hand hovering over her mug of tea, every instinct telling her that something was wrong. She lived miles from the nearest neighbor, and it was the middle of a thunderstorm. No one should have been out in this weather. The knock came again, louder this time. She glanced out the window, seeing nothing but the dark, rain-soaked trees bending in the wind. She grabbed her phone, dialing her brother's number as she walked to the door, her heart hammering. But the line wouldn't connect. No bars. The storm must have knocked out the signal. "Who's there?" she called through the door, her voice steady despite the chill creeping up her spine. For a moment, there was silence. Then a voice, thin and wavering, just barely audible over the storm. "Please, let me in." Julia felt a shiver run down her spine. It sounded like a child, a little girl. But something about the voice felt off. The tone was hollow, devoid of emotion, as though the words were coming from someone who didn't understand what they meant. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Julia asked, her hand resting on the door handle. The girl's voice responded, but it was even softer now, barely a whisper. "I'm cold. Please, let me in." Julia's hand tightened on the doorknob, her instincts screaming at her to leave it locked. "Where are your parents? Why are you out here alone?" She tried to peer through the peephole, but the rain was coming down in sheets, obscuring everything outside. No answer. Julia's heart raced. She could feel an intense pressure building around her, the air thick and heavy. She backed away from the door, debating whether to call the police, though she knew it might be hours before they could reach her in this storm. Then suddenly, the knocking started again, harder and faster this time, a frenzy of pounding that echoed through the house, making her heart jump with each strike. "Let me in," the girl's voice said, but now it was louder, more insistent. The voice held a sharp edge that sent a chill through Julia's bones. It sounded wrong, like a recording sped up with a strange, almost metallic echo. "Please go away," Julia said, her voice trembling. The knocking stopped. Silence hung in the air, thick and oppressive. She waited, straining to hear anything over the rain, but the only sound was her own heartbeat, thundering in her ears. She turned to walk away, telling herself she would just go upstairs, lock herself in her room, and wait out the storm. But as she took a step back, she heard something that made her blood run cold. The girl was whispering through the door. Julia couldn't make out the words at first, but as she listened, her stomach twisted. The girl was repeating Julia's own words back to her. "Please go away." The voice mimicked a distorted mockery of Julia's tone. "Please go away." Julia backed up, her eyes never leaving the door, feeling a rising sense of dread. And then, with an eerie suddenness, the voice changed. It was no longer a little girl's voice, but a deeper, raspier whisper, one that sounded impossibly close, as if it were right next to her ear. "You're alone in there, aren't you?" Julia's breath caught. She was alone. She'd always loved her solitude, but hearing the stranger say it aloud felt like a cruel taunt, a reminder of just how isolated she truly was. A scraping sound echoed from outside, like fingernails dragging down the door. She stumbled back, heart racing as the whisper continued, cold and relentless. "Open the door, Julia. Let me in." How did it know her name? Panicking, she ran to the kitchen, grabbing the biggest knife she could find. She stood there, gripping the handle so tightly her knuckles turned white, her eyes fixed on the front door as she struggled to steady her breathing. The voice persisted, slipping back into the childlike tone, almost singing. "Let me in. I'm so cold. So very, very cold." The doorknob began to rattle, turning slowly, and Julia's stomach lurched. She hadn't locked it. How had she forgotten to lock it? In a rush of terror, she ran forward, grabbing the doorknob just as it twisted. She pressed her weight against the door, but whatever was on the other side pushed back, strong and unyielding. She could hear it breathing now, heavy and rasping, inches away from her. "Please," it whispered, the voice so close it seemed to seep through the wood. "I just want to come inside. I won't hurt you. I promise." Her grip tightened on the doorknob, her hand trembling. "Leave me alone," she screamed, her voice breaking with fear. The pressure on the door ceased. Silence. Julia waited, her ear pressed against the wood, listening. She heard nothing. No breathing, No whispers, just the soft patter of rain. Slowly, she released her grip, stepping back from the door. She took a shaky breath, relief washing over her. But then, a soft, rhythmic tapping began on the window next to the door. She turned, her stomach twisting as she saw the faint outline of a face pressed against the glass. Wide, unblinking eyes stared at her through the rain-streaked window, too large and round, with a mouth that stretched into an unnatural smile. "Let me in," it whispered, the voice muffled by the glass, but somehow louder, more insistent. The smile grew wider, stretching almost impossibly across its face, as if it were amused by her terror. Julia stumbled back, her heart pounding, and she turned to run. She bolted up the stairs, slamming her bedroom door behind her and locking it. She pressed her back against the door, her eyes darting around the room, searching for anything she could use to barricade herself. Then she heard it again, the soft tapping, now at her bedroom window. Her heart stopped. Slowly she turned, dread filling her as she saw the same face, smiling at her through the window on the second floor. Its wide eyes followed her movements, and that twisted, impossibly wide grin seemed to mock her desperation. She backed away, pressing herself into the corner of the room, clutching the knife with trembling hands. And then the voice came again, soft and chilling. "You can't hide, Julia. I'll always find you." The smile faded and the face melted into the darkness, leaving only the storm outside. Julia stayed in that corner until the first light of dawn crept through her window. When she finally dared to look outside, there was no trace of anyone, no footprints, no sign of anyone having been there at all. But as she stumbled downstairs, exhausted and shaken, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Scratched into the wood of her front door in long, jagged letters was a message. "Next time, let me in." And from that day forward, she never felt truly alone again.